is Xavier Mouy, and as Philippe said, I'm so an acoustician and a PhD student at the University of Victoria. Since it's about acoustics, I'm going to play quite a few sounds. So if you have headphones with you, let's see. If you have headphones with you, I think I would suggest putting them on, just so you have a better kind of appreciation of the different types of sound I'm going to play. So before I get started, I just wanted to introduce myself. So I studied, so I did my Bachelor of Science in Le Mans in France, where I'm from. And my training is in acoustic engineering. So that means try to understand the physics to understand how sound propagates. And most of the things I was supposed to do, I was mostly working in this industry for studying vibration of cars and in particular car engines and trying to reduce the noise. Work with architects to design concert halls or classrooms. And one thing I've worked for several months in is urban acoustics. So try to measure and simulate sound from urban infrastructures. So trains and see how it affects insulation for different buildings. So my training is not in biology, it's mostly in physics and engineering. But over the years, I've been working with several biologists, and so I'm learning more and more, and I'm sure most of the people tonight are biologists and will have many questions. And then, so then I moved to Canada and met Dr. Yvan Simard in Rimouski, and that really opened kind of my vision of acoustics, because I discovered underwater bioacoustics. So how to use sound, how can we listen in the ocean to learn more about the marine environment and about the distribution of animals, and most particularly marine mammals. So I worked for several years with Dr. Simard on detecting automatically the calls from blue and fin whales in the St. Lawrence for monitoring them and try to lower ship strikes. Then I was lucky to find a job at JASCO Applied Sciences, which is a research and development company. It's based in, well, there's an office in Halifax where I started, and now I'm working in Victoria. So I've been involved in similar things as my master, so monitoring marine mammals using sound. Most of my first 9 or 10 years were mostly working in the Arctic to monitor bowhead whales and walruses. And more recently, I've been focusing on project in British Columbia, and mostly, as you can probably expect, working on southern resident killer whales. So I'm still working at JASCO as a scientist, but a few years ago, I decided to go back to school and do my PhD at the School of Earth and Ocean Sciences here at Uvic. And this time working on fish sounds, and that's what I'm gonna talk about tonight. So to get started with the topic, I thought I would start with 2 stories. The first story brings us back in time during the Cold War. So early 1980s, there was a lot of spying going on between different countries and lots of tensions between the Soviet Union and the rest of the world. One of the story that people usually remember is the event called Whiskey on the Rocks. And that what happened is a Soviet submarine was spying off the Swedish waters, and that was a submarine of the Whiskey class. And because of navigation errors, this submarine went aground on a big rock, hence the name of that event, Whiskey on the Rocks. So as you can imagine, that provoked a lot of tensions, even more tensions between Sweden and the Soviet Union. And since then, I guess the Swedish Navy has increased their monitoring of their waters. One of the ways to monitor their waters was to deploy hydrophones in the ocean, so underwater microphones. So just by listening at the sounds in the ocean, then they could detect the noise from the propellers and from the machinery inside the submarines and try to detect any other intrusions from Soviet Union. And despite the fact that the Prime Minister of Sweden had been pretty clear with Boris Yeltsin that there would be no more intrusion tolerated, Sweden kept recording some sound that they thought were from Soviet submarines. And some of the sound they recorded were like this. So before I continue, can you please confirm that you heard that sound?
Yeah.
Yes. Yes.
Wonderful, thank you.
Yes.
So then that, as you can imagine, that even more increased tensions between the two countries. And it's only several years later that some researchers got a hold of some acoustic recordings that were collected. And they found out that the sound that you just heard was not from a Soviet submarine, but from this little fish, the herring. And funnily enough, this fish is producing sound by releasing bubbles through the anal duct in the ocean. And just the mechanism of releasing bubbles in the ocean makes this ticking sound that you've heard. So you multiply that by several thousands of fish in a school of fish, and then apparently that's some sound that could be mistaken as a Soviet submarine. There's absolutely a great talk, a TEDx talk that you can watch on YouTube from Magnus Wahlberg, which is who is one of the researchers who's discovered that sound mechanism. So I would highly recommend to watch it if you can. So this one was what's called like air passage sound. So it's the air from the swim bladder that is transferred to the intestine and then was exposed from the anal duct. So basically that's a fart. So that was the herring. But there are other species that also kind of use the same mechanism, but instead of going from the back, it goes from the front. So the air goes through the gills or the mouth, and that's a burp. And other species also just kind of have this volume of air going back and forth between intestine and the swim bladder. And that's produced kind of more like a whistle and squeaky sounds. So now my second story that you're probably familiar with is happening in North America on the West Coast. And it has happened actually in other parts of the world too. But so people living close to the ocean, when late spring, early summer was coming, then they kept hearing this humming sound that was really annoying and that kept them awake for most of the night. And that's the sound they could hear. So obviously people were annoyed and didn't really know what they were, what was producing this. And there were some theories that were totally not funded, and kind of funny to mention is that there are some theories saying that, oh, that might be aliens, alien activities, or even secret military activities going on. Of course, that's not the case. So several years later, there was some research done and that found out that actually this humming sound is also produced by a fish that is coming in shallow water to call and attract females. As I said, that happened at several places around the world, but in North America on the West Coast, the culprit was the plainfin midshipman. And I'm sure you're familiar with that species. So it lives in deep water most of the year, and when it's time to reproduce in spring, early summer, then it goes back to very shallow water and then does these humming sounds during the night to attract females. But that's not the only Oh, yeah. So this time it's not releasing air bubbles. It's using a different mechanism. Basically, this fish, it's still using the swim bladder, but this time it has sonic muscles, so there are specialized muscles that are wrapped around the swim bladder, and that can contract extremely fast. And then this contraction on the swim bladder makes the humming sound that you've heard. It's not the only fish and not the only mechanism that exists in fish. For example, catfish produce sound by bone stridulation, so by moving bones together. Or seahorses, they move the bone from their skull together and to do this clinking sound. Or even sound that are not intentional, like for the parrotfish, as it's eating on corals, then you can hear the crunching sound. So since several of these fish are producing sound, like, can we actually use this information to monitor fish in the wild? It's totally non-intrusive. What you need to put hydrophones in the water and just listen. So if it works, that would be a great way to monitor fish. So if we have a look at what's already there, like some of the methods that people are using to monitor fish. So there's trawling. So you catch fish, you have direct access to the samples. You can identify the fish, you can measure them, you can take some samples from them and do some analysis. You can also cover a fairly large spatial area. Obviously, the counter is pretty destructive. You're taking the fish and you're obviously keeping them. And it's not suitable for some environment and also costly. If you want to be less intrusive, then you can have a diving surveys. You can still do some basic measurements, like counting the fish or length and identifying the different species. But you're limited this time to shallow water, so a much smaller spatial coverage. So now if you want to go deeper, you can use robots, so remotely operated vehicles. And those are nice, but obviously expensive. Something that is kind of, we don't always think about on ROVs are disturbance from, I think, light disturbance, I think, is well known, but acoustic disturbance too. Those robots are emitting sound from the different thrusters and propellers, and it's also pinging, try to locate itself so you can run along a precise transect. And it has shown in some studies that the sound from the ROV can actually bias what you're looking at. And that's the sound that you can hear in the background. So then you also have fixed cameras. So you put cameras on, well, one of the options is to put that on the bottom. This time it's totally acoustically quiet. If it's cabled to shore, as it is the case here in Victoria with Ocean Networks Canada, then you can have very long time series. Some of the problems or cons, I guess, are some limited spatial coverage. You're relying on visibility. For example, that might work well in the winter, but if you have a camera at the mouth of the Fraser Delta, then your visibility is going to be none in May during the freshet. And also some light disturbance. If you want to go deep, you can, but you need some external lights here that can also include input some bias in your measurements. You can have acoustic tags. So those are tiny acoustic transmitters that you put on fish. And those emit a sound that is encoded. So when you receive it on the hydrophone, then you know it's this fish that was tagged at this location. And it's very nice. It has done it. You can do really cool research with that type of monitoring, but it's obviously intrusive. And you can only track a small number of individuals. And finally, the active acoustic. So you're not listening, but well, you're also inputting acoustic energy in the environment. So with echo sonders. So this is great. You have long time series. You can do really neat measurements of density of some fish and study some vertical migrations that can happen and so forth. Some of the challenges are sometimes identify the species is not always easy. And also you can have some possible acoustic disturbance, even though that's at high frequencies, you're still inputting some acoustic energy in the environment. So now, in all those methods, they all work together, and what you're looking for is having long time series and over large spatial coverage. So you have a good picture of what's going on in your environment. So now, what about passive acoustics? So just listening. It's used now for monitoring whales, like marine mammals. And the picture I show here, the map, it's in northern Alaska, and it shows how passive acoustic monitoring was used to track bowhead whales as they're migrating during the summer from the Bering Sea to the Beaufort Sea. So the yellow dots that you see are acoustic recorders that were deployed on the seafloor for several months to even a year. And then it records continuously or on duty cycle. As you record some calls from bowheads, you can distinguish them from other species. Then you can count the calls. And then the map that you see here is basically the number of calls that were recorded over a whole season at the different locations. So you see that on the northern side, you see that there were way more bowhead whales, and that basically is the migration corridor that bowhead whales use to go to the Beaufort Sea. So it's useful, it's non-intrusive, and it covers large spatial coverage over a long period of time. So it seemed like it has good potential to be used for fish as well. So now, if we wanted to use passive acoustics to monitor fish in British Columbia, what would it take? That would take hydrophones. So underwater microphones that you basically record the ocean sounds and noise. The map that you see here is from a WWF report that basically shows the different hydrophones that are deployed along the BC coast by several institutions. Some have been recording for several months. Some have been recording for many years. So you see that there's good coverage along the coast. There are certainly some gaps, but it's a good starting point. So now you need to have fish that produce sound, otherwise that doesn't work. So if we have a look at 4 of the locations that have hydrophones. So the first one in Araguay, some of the sound that were recorded there. So these are fish sounds. And now if we go further south in the Great Bear Rainforest, some other grunting sound from fish that are different. If you go even further south in the Strait of Georgia, again, different fish sounds. And then in Hornby Island, so we see that we have fish sounds at several locations across British Columbia from north to south, and they're pretty diverse. And if you look at this graph here, it's the number of fish calls that have been detected at Hornby Island during the summer months. That was, I believe, 2014. So you see that each bar is the number of fish detection per day. So you see that basically there's not a single day where there were no fish sounds. So it's kind of ticked this mark, say like, okay, we have fish sounds at different places. They're different, which is promising. And also you can record them most of the year or most of the time. So it seemed like we have all the ingredients to do some passive acoustic monitoring. But there's one key information that is missing, is like we know, or we have a educated guess that those sounds are from fish, but we don't know what species. And obviously that's an information that is crucial if you want to be able to use passive acoustic monitoring for example, fisheries management or marine conservations and so forth. So that turns out to, yeah, so if we, what can you do to do that, to basically identify fish sounds? One thing that kind of seems logical is to take the fish, put them in tanks, and record them. It has led to great studies and still does. But not always the fish vocalizes. And one of the reasons, I think, as you can imagine, fish don't really like to be taken out of their habitats into a tank. And sometimes even if that fish vocalizes in the wild, then sometimes it just doesn't vocalize in tanks. There's some other issues with recording in tanks is the physics of like how the sound propagates in tanks. So it's pretty like a closed, confined environment. And as if the fish is producing a sound, then the sound is bouncing on the walls from the tank, and then all the reflections are interfering with each other and are distorting the sound. So even if you're recording something, you have to be extremely careful about if you record something, is that actually realistic of what you would record in the wild? So another way to then to avoid that is to go in the field. So you put acoustic recorders here on the bottom. You have a picture of an autonomous recorder. That's the one that was off Hornby Island, and that records sounds continuously for several months. So if you hear a fish sound, then if you have a camera on the side, here this shot was taken from a GoPro, and if you see a fish on the video and you hear a fish sound, then say, okay, that must be that fish that made the sound. So for example, here, you look closely at the picture, you see like bottom left, you see like this little fish, which I think is a black-eyed goby, and you heard that sound, say, okay, that's the black-eyed goby that produced that sound. But if you look a bit closer, then you see that there are also many other fish around. So there's nothing that tells you that actually the black-eyed goby that I saw first is the one producing the sound. Like furthermore, there's nothing that tells you that there's no like a school of fish that behind the field of view of the camera that is vocalizing. So there's an issue there. So you need to see underwater, so you need to have the video. You need to hear underwater with the hydrophones, but that's not enough. So you need to be able to localize in 3 dimensions. So you need to be able to tell precisely like from which fish on the video the sound is coming from. And so that comes to my PhD research. So that's what I'm trying to achieve. So catalog fish sounds, not in labs, but in the wild. For this, as I said, I need like a video camera, I need acoustic recorders, and also I need to do some acoustic localization. So now those are kind of the crucial aspects that are absolutely needed. But there are other considerations that I added is I wanted this type of instrument that allows to catalog fish in the wild to be autonomous, so I can deploy in the ocean for several weeks, and also portable, because I wanted to be able to come back to all those places that I shown on the map before, and basically deploy and try to collect as much species as I could. So that involves building an instrument, so that's some hardware components and software to do the localization. And once we have that figured out, then we can go in the field and deploy that and catalog fish sounds. So let's have a look at each of the components. The first one, the video camera. So as I said, there are some video cameras that exist on the market. The GoPro is a popular one. one of the issue with that that camera is that I can only record videos for a few hours, and that's not enough for what I wanted to do. So unfortunately, there was no other options on the market, so we had to come up with our own solution. So we designed an autonomous camera that we call the fish cam that can record for up to a couple of weeks of video data, and that is open source and low cost. So it costed around like $600 Canadian. So it has like a pack of D-cell batteries that are rechargeable on one side, and on the other side you have all the electronics components. There's two parts of the electronic components. The first one obviously is the camera that is managing all the video, the camera sensor, and the storage. And on the other side you also have a buzzer that is beeping once in a while at a schedule. And this is done to synchronize the video data with the hydrophones, which is obviously crucial. You want to make sure that when you listen to something on the hydrophones, then you know exactly what time it was on the video. Then we packaged everything in pressure housing, one that was homemade based on a design that was done in Newfoundland, and that was pretty low cost. And the other one was something off the shelf that we purchased from California that is so a bit more expensive, but also can go deeper and tend to be a bit more reliable. We made this whole design open source and published kind of the step-by-step building instructions. So hopefully other people that need that kind of instrument can replicate it. So it kind of ticked the mark for the video camera. Now the acoustic recorders. That was surprisingly the easy part, but the most expensive, because there are solutions that exist on the market. We chose two of them, two different instruments. The first one was an AMR from JASCO Applied Sciences that is based in Victoria. And the other one is a Soundtrap, that is a smaller recorder made in New Zealand. So the AMR is great because it can record up to a month with like 6 hydrophones or even more, but in my case, 6 at fairly high sampling rate. But it's heavy and also more expensive. For the Soundtrap, then that's much a lighter design that basically fits in the palm of my hand. You can still fit 4 hydrophones and that can record for 10 days. So we use kind of those two acoustic recorders and I'll show you later in kind of what design we use them both. And now acoustic localization. And actually that's something we do every day as like human. If you just close your eyes and just listen to the world around you, like you can tell like where that bird is that it's chirping or the car that is passing behind you, even though you don't see them, like you can still tell just by listening where those sound sources are. One example that I like to give is the one from my daughter, Charlotte, that you see on the picture. So somehow she's obsessed with catching flies, but she's not very fast, and also flies are small and they go very fast. So what she does is she just closes her eyes and just listens. And just by listening to the sound of the fly, she can tell fairly precisely where the fly is in the room and how it moves, and hopefully try to catch it. And that's due like in part to like the sound coming towards your ears, and it's coming to one ear before the other. So this small time delay can be interpreted by your brain by a fairly precise location in space. So the good thing is that we can use the same principle underwater, except this time we're not limited to 2 ears. So we can use several hydrophones, and the more hydrophones, the better. Here on the diagram that you see, it's an example of a design that uses 6 hydrophones, the colored dots. So as a fish is swimming and producing sound, the sound wave is traveling through the array and is received at a little different time at every hydrophone. Then we recover the signal, we can measure the time difference between each of the hydrophones, and from that we can have an accurate location of the fish, of the sound that it produced. So we want something that is fairly accurate. Like we can localize, but if you can localize with an uncertainty of plus or minus 100 meters, then that's not of very good use for me. So something that we had to make sure is that the uncertainty in the localization process was good, meaning small. And that's what is depicted here for the same kind of configuration of hydrophones. You see that what's in the middle of the array, so in between all the hydrophones, it's in the blue color, meaning that we can localize very accurately inside within like an uncertainty of a few centimeters. And then as if the fish is localizing outside the array, then that the uncertainty kind of increases, sorry. So we are less accurate in our localization. So then with those kind of estimates, like you can play with different hydrophone configurations and number of hydrophones and how they're oriented with each other to basically optimize like your design and to make sure that your localization inside your array are accurate. And so at the end, like using the same design, then you can localize in 3D. So again, same design here. The red dots that you see are a fish sound that was localized in 3 dimensions. And the black cross basically denote the errors, so the uncertainty in the localization. So you see that we localized that fish in the middle of the array and with an uncertainty of a few centimeters. So this way we can quantify this, and when you will look at the camera to see what fish that was, then we're pretty certain that that was the fish producing the sound. In that case, that was a pilot study that was done in Cape Cod for kind of a preliminary study of my PhD. So now we have all the ingredients. We know how to record video, we know how to record audio, we know how to do the localization. So we need something to kind of wrap everything together into an instrument that we can deploy in the field. So not all fish live in the same environment. And so there's unfortunately not like one size fits all. So we developed 3 different arrays, and those 3 arrays had kind of different pros and cons and are adapted to different environments and different species and kind of different logistical constraints. So the first was the large array, and there's a mini array and a mobile array. So let's have a look at the large array. So it's basically made out of PVC pipes that can be all disassembled. The size is about like 2 meters in width, 2 meters by 2 meters by 3 meters high. So it's portable, you can assemble that in about an hour. You have a camera, one of the fish cam on top, one of the fish cam on the bottom, on the side. So you have a good, complete field of view of what's going on inside the array. Then we have divers to deploy it on the sea bottom for several weeks, and we let it record. The fish are swimming through the array, they make sound, we can localize the sound, look at the video, and identify fish sounds. That's a great array. It's the one that produces the most accurate localization, which is good, but it's quite big, and it requires a decent boat to deploy it. So to deploy more often and in different places, we put together the mini array, which is kind of the smaller version of that, which is only one single fish cam that is looking on the side. And here we have these smaller acoustic recorders with 4 hydrophones. So it can be deployed just by 1 or 2 divers and with a surface support by just an inflatable boat. So much easier to deploy. So the hydrophones are much closer than with the large array. So you can still do localization, but this time you basically can do define the azimuth and the elevation or where the sound comes from. So when you have a fish that is basically in front of the camera, you're still able to tell like if that's the one making the sound. And finally, the smaller array, which is a mobile array. And this time we use the same small recorder with the 4 hydrophones, but we strap that on top of an underwater drone. So this is even smaller and lighter, so only one person can use it. You can go on an inflatable boat, you deploy the drone in the water, and basically you can scoot around the rocky reefs. You're not constrained by like flat bottom, so you can really explore and see where the fish are. Once you find a good spot, you can either drift away, cut all the props, or you can also sit on the bottom and wait for the fish to come by. So here you have some beautiful copper rockfish that are vocalizing in front of the camera. So with the three systems, basically we can cover different grounds and different species. So we had those three, and we were ready to deploy them around Victoria. So we chose several sites. Those are the stars that you see on that map. We use the sites for different reasons. One, we wanted to target some species particularly. So we talked to local divers and biologists and basically asked them for their inputs or where we're more likely to find these specific fish, and then different habitats. One of the choices also that some reason that drove those choices is like, look at where other people have been collecting data for a very long time. So here, for example, of Nanaimo, Fisheries in Ocean Canada has recorded sound, and we're interested more specifically in fish sounds for about a year. So they have a very nice 1 year long data set with fish sounds. So they don't know, or we don't know like what species they are. So deploying at that location then would allow to come back to that nice time series and basically label those fish sounds with specific species and have basically more useful information. So that would not be honest to say that everything went well. We developed those instruments, and that's great. We collected great data, because that wouldn't really reflect the truth and would not really reflect, I think, research in general. So we had some problems. And you might actually have heard about my research in the news. Not exactly the reason why I want to be known, but basically with the first deployment that we've done in Cadborough Bay, the camera didn't work, so we did collect some acoustic data, but with no camera, which was not very useful. The second deployment was off Sydney, and this time the whole instrument was basically washed off by a storm, and so we never found. Well, we were not able to find that instrument again. So that was a bummer, but then surprisingly, kind of for a small story here, 6 months later, a lady called me saying that they found some piece of equipment from Uvic at Clover Point. So it happens that some parts of the array drifted away to Clover Point. So 6 months later, and about like 60 kilometers south, I was still able to get the camera, at least not the hydrophones. And so this time the camera worked, but I lost the instruments. But anyway, I wanted to mention that because we tend to kind of report on things that work and that provides good data. I thought that would also reflect a bit more like kind of the truth and the whole kind of research process of showing also things that don't work. So, and overall, this whole kind of set of failures kind of made, I had to rebuild the whole array from scratch, which also like improved the design, and now we were able to collect much better data. So now I want to focus on actual good results and look at data that were collected off Hornby Island. So what you see here is the view from the fish cam that is looking down the big array. So the square that you see is basically the basis of the large PVC frame. And then at each of the corners, you have hydrophones, and in the middle, you have a hydrophone as well. In the middle, like kind of the gray cylinders, are the battery pack and the acoustic recorder. So I'm gonna play this scene. You'll have the video and also the sound from the hydrophones. There will be several fish swimming through, and you will also hear two sequences of fish sounds. So there's quite a few going on. So I'll play this sequence once, and we kind of summarize what's going on, and then I'll play it again with the localization results. There you go. Oops. So you can hear the sound. So you see at the top of the array, you have here a fish. So it's about like 80 centimeters long or something. It's a lingcod that is sitting on the array. Now on the bottom right here, on the bottom left, sorry, you see a quillback rockfish that started here and then follow the rocks on the left here. And at the same time, at the bottom, you have another quillback rockfish that is going here. You heard some fish sound, and that rockfish moved on the left as the lingcod moved. And the other quillback is going through with his friends on the left here. And the second sequence of fish sounds. The lingcod moves back. In the meantime, there was another quillback rockfish that went on the side that was crossing the array as well. So 4 different fish. So if you don't do any localization, it's just impossible to tell like which one produced those 2 sequences of sound. So to summarize, there was one quillback rockfish that started at the bottom left and went up. The circles that you see are basically where that fish was when we heard the 2 sequences of fish sounds. There was another quillback rockfish that kind of swam towards the center of the array, and then as the lingcod moved, went left and then up to the left with the other quillback rockfish. Again, the 2 circles are where that fish was when we've heard the 2 fish sounds. And then the lingcods, sorry, and then the quillback that was at the top right. So if we can localize the sound at one of those circles, then we can tell which fish produced the sound. So now playing again that sequence, but with the whole information. So on the top left, you have the video camera, so exactly the same thing, just zoomed out. On the right, you have the acoustic localization. So the square that you see here is the square that you see on the video, the basis of the PVC frame. You have hydrophones on each corner in the middle, and it's about like 2 meters on each side. On the bottom, you have the spectrograms. If you're not familiar with spectrogram, it's just an image representation of the sound. So you have the time on the x-axis and the frequency on the y-axis. And the color denotes the energy of the sound. So you see like those red vertical bars here. So that was the first sequence of fish sounds that we've heard. And then the other sequence of fish sounds are those vertical red bars here in this graph. So now I'll play again the video, and when a sound is going to be localized, it's going to appear on the localization graph as a red dot and with the black cross that denotes the uncertainty in the localization. So let's go. So now at the time you have the quillback rockfish that just goes away to the left, and that was localized here. And then it meets the other quillback rockfish on the left, and the sound that we've heard is localized where the quillback rockfish were. So now we can tell that the sound that we've heard were from quillback rockfish. So that's kind of our first page of the fish sound catalog here. Now another example. I'm not going to go through all the process this time because there's much less going on. But what you have is like here on the bottom half of the array, you have probably the same lingcod actually sitting on the recorder. At some point, it's going to move and it's going to go towards the bottom left corner and leave the array. You see in the spectrogram, again, some vertical bars that are a sequence of fish sounds. So I'm going to play that again. You have the lingcod in the middle. And now it moves and goes to the corner. And we can localize the sound in the bottom left corner. So now that's our second page of the fish sound catalog. So now we have quillback and we have lingcod. So that's a good start. And something that was very encouraging in those first set of results is that those species are quite important in British Columbia. Quillback rockfish are listed as threatened by the Committee of the Status of Endangered Wildlife in Canada. And the stock of lingcod in the Strait of Georgia is listed as cautious by the DFO precautionary approach framework. So both are quite important species that are that the DFO is trying to monitor closely. So now to put that back in perspective, hopefully with the sound that we started to identify for the two species, hopefully we can use that information now to help marine conservation or fisheries management. One of the good, nice application that hopefully it's gonna be useful for is for monitoring rockfish conservation areas. So in British Columbia, you have like 164 rockfish conservation areas that are the yellow patches you see on the map. And those are areas that are protected, well, not protected, but with restricted fishery in there to basically protect rockfishes, but also lingcods, and to have the population basically to bounce back again. So if we can use that passive acoustic monitoring to help monitor the rockfish conservation areas, then that would be really useful, because the methods that are currently available allow to do some monitoring, but it's not efficient and don't allow to cover large areas over a long period of time. So now if we step back even more, like if we see kind of, if we want to use it for marine conservation, now we have some pieces of the puzzle to make it useful. We have some instruments that can record and localize. Now we're starting to build up this catalog of fish sounds, so we kind of know what species is producing which sound. So we know when that species is present in the environment. And another piece of the puzzle that I haven't talked about, but that I'm working on, is having efficient methods to go through the acoustic data. It's nice to collect months and years of data, but if we can't process them, then it's not useful, and you're just not able to listen to everything. So they're working on some algorithm that can basically go through data efficiently and find those fish calls and label them as species. So those are nice, but there's a critical piece of that puzzle that is missing if we really want to have it useful, is to find out like fish densities. It's nice to see that this species of fish is present in that environment, but it would be so much more useful to know how many fish or the relative abundance of that fish in that environment. And that's something I'm unfortunately won't have time to do for my research, but will hopefully do after my PhD, hopefully. It's kind of a simplified view. There are obviously other pieces of that puzzle, but that's kind of to give you an overview. So if we can resolve the finch density, then I think it's going to start to be more efficient and to integrate passive acoustics as another tool in the toolkit to monitor fish in the wild. So that's it. So obviously this research would not be possible with my two supervisors. So Dr. Francis Juanes from the biology department at Uvic and Dr. Stan Dosso from the School of Earth and Ocean Sciences. They have been supporting in so many ways, and I'm extremely lucky to have them, as well as other collaborators, Morgan Black, Kieran Cox, and Jessica Cayley, who have been absolutely instrumental in the field part of the project in organizing all the diving and all the deploying all the instruments in the water. So a huge thanks to them. Obviously funding, so organizations have been funding my research, and also many volunteers that just gave their time and weekends and evenings to work with me in the field and help me collect those precious data. With this, I'm done. Thanks for your attention. I hope you enjoyed it, and I'm looking forward to have your questions. if somehow you can't ask your question tonight, you can be reached by email from my Uvic email below. I'm also on social media, and I post regularly some updates on my research. And there's also a blog where I basically try to post updates on the fish sound project. Well, thank you.
Great, thank you very much, Xavier. Excellent. So I guess we'll open it up to questions. Let's see. There was one question on chat. It was right in the beginning, I think.
Mm-hmm.
Somebody wondering about the humming sound with that picture of the boathouses. How did the humans figure out what was making that noise?
Actually, I don't know the specifics, but basically they go so shallow, those plain fin midshipmen, that you can just like have the lift up rocks and have the midshipmen, and you just hear them just by your ears. But I don't know all the specifics, but once you know it, I guess that's pretty obvious.
Good. Anyone else? Maybe I could ask you a question.
For sure.
I have my hands up, sorry.
Oh, sorry. I don't see all the people. Go ahead.
Very, very interesting talk. I really enjoyed it. Thank you very much. I have two questions. First of all, what is the frequency of the sounds that the equipments record?
So the equipment can record up to like 250 kilohertz, which is, we can record basically the highest click in marine mammals, which is harbor porpoise. But for fish sounds, we don't need to sample that high, because the higher you sample and the more data it's going to take. Most of the fish sounds have frequencies below 1 kilohertz. Some do have like above that, but it's in the scale of a few kilohertz.
So if, for example, hypothetically, there is a whale in the distance and the equipment will record the sound, and considering that sound traveled much faster, how do you able to actually identify things like that, like dolphin or whale in distance? I mean, the equipment will still record, but there won't be anything monitored, right? Like on video, I mean.
No, not on video. So here I'm really focusing on fish sound. So I do occasionally record marine mammals, and those they produce some specific sound that in most cases you can attribute to a species, because some of their repertoire have been documented. But then so those basically I'm not really spending too much time on them, but all the lowest frequency that I can't label as marine mammal, then I localize them and look at the videos. And even if the fish is outside the field of view of the camera, then I'm not going to be able to use it. It has to be covered somehow by the camera, and has an accuracy in the localization that is good enough for me to be certain that's what I see is what I hear.
Okay, perfect. Thank you.
It looked like Tom Rankin has a question.
Great talk. Just thinking in terms of sensory modalities, I presume there's a lot of literature on the sensitivity of different species to the different frequencies. So I guess I don't have an obvious question, but presumably there would be some type of coupling between their ability to perceive and interpret sort of these sounds and the type of sounds that we produce, I would guess. Do you have such information, like for obviously the midshipmen or the rockfish, etc.? What do they hear? What are they most sensitive to?
So there is some information about audiograms of fish. So we do have some information and about like the hearing curve that they have. So you can have an idea of what they hear, but it's mostly done for pressure. So they I guess two components of the sound that is travel is the pressure, which is just a scalar value, and but also particle motion. And the fish can can mostly sense, I think, particle motion and sometimes also pressure. So for example, when you have the herring with the swim bladder that is close to the otolith, I believe, so it can sense the two ways of sound. So there are some audiograms for pressure, but even then, there are some troubles with methodology, and there are now a lot of people working on standardizing the way to measure audiograms, because from one measurement to the other, even on the same species, you have like completely different results. But there is some information. And on the particle motion aspect, then there's much less information just because it's very hard to measure.
So watching that lingcod swim along the sensor with regard to the quillback, like presumably there is already a coupling between that lingcod is already perceptive of those sounds being made by the quillback. You know, this would be presumably the case. Is that so? Did you infer that? Did you assume that?
Not particularly. So I'm tackling on the aspect of the monitoring aspect, in the sense that I want to be able to monitor fish, and I'm not taking the perspective of what the fish hears, which is also very interesting. But I didn't take that as a component.
Sure, I understand you. Yes, thank you.
Like for example, maybe I'll have, like for example, there's some fish like the parrotfish that is crunching on corals. It's that's only my guess, but my guess is like the noise is not produced intentionally. It's just a byproduct of eating, but it still can be useful for monitoring.
Right. Yeah. Thank you.
Yeah. Thanks.
Okay, it looks like we have a question from Alison Moran. You'd like to go ahead?
Yeah, thank you. That was a really great talk, Xavier. I loved it. Thanks. I was wondering, with all the sounds you're collecting, are you seeing anything like dialect, or are there differences depending on the age and size class of your fish within the same species?
Not yet. So I showed some of the results, and I'm still crunching through the data. So I'm not quite there at that point, but that's something I'll have hopefully have a look at to start to have an idea. I was talking to an ecologist not long ago, and he mentioned that just basically the size of the fish would be extremely useful. And not being a biologist myself, I think, okay, that's cool. And if the fish is producing the sound with the swim bladder, maybe then the size of the fish will be relative size of the swim bladder, and maybe you can see differences in the sound that you receive. We're very far from it now, but eventually I'm really hoping we can have a look at it. There certainly will have some data to start to have a look at this.
Wonderful project. Thank you very much.
Thanks.
There's a few questions on the chat line here. Were you doing the data processing? Do you know what language it was coded in?
So I use a mix of languages, but I use mostly Python.
Okay, hopefully that means something to another question, how many fish have been cataloged and how many are left to go?
How many are left to go? That's a big question. Basically, something I didn't mention, like both like the quillback and the lingcods have not been like cataloged before, so this is new, but presumably like there's much more that we don't know about. Like kind of the rockfish, we had a good hint that it would vocalize, well, make sound just because it has a swim bladder, and other species of rockfish have been documented to produce sound. But for the lingcod, that was kind of like a surprise to me, at least. It doesn't have any swim bladder, so it's producing the sound somehow, but not with the swim bladder. So yeah, so how much to go like now? So I have those two species. 2 or 3 species that I'm still need to basically do some more measurements before I can tell you with confidence that those are those species. So hopefully at the end of my PhD, I'll have like 5 or 6 species with some different examples. And how much more to go? I think, I don't know, it's hard to say. Just looking at, I just sampled a very small area, like just around Victoria, basically. When you look at the sounds recorded at the Great Bear Rainforest or of Adagwai, those sounds are different. So presumably some from different species or different behaviors. So I don't have a firm answer, but there's a lot of cool things to discover.
Good. And another question from John Harper. Have you been able to attribute the sounds to any specific fish behavior, like a warning to other fish?
Yeah, not quite yet. I guess I have too few measurements to do any conclusions. From some like it's totally subjective here, but sometimes it seemed like the quillback that was basically fleeing from the lingcod, so it seemed like kind of fleeing or going away behavior, but that I'm not there yet. Once we have cataloged and all the videos and all the samples, then that'd be nice to team up with some people that know what they're talking about in terms of like fish behavior and stuff like that, and try to associate sound with behavior.
So was each sound for the 2 species the same every time, or is there variability? And
so there is some variability. There's also, we're starting to see sequences. Basically, there's some features that you hear like in frequency and time, so duration and how the call is spread out in frequency. But what I'm finding out is also there are some sequences, so like tac tac ball, and so this fish is mostly doing those 2 knocks and this grunt always together. So, and for the lingcod is doing like these sequences of knocks, and then it stops, it swims away, and then it sits on the bottom and does another sequence. So at the end, I'll have a better grasp on like the variability, but even though it's still going to be a pretty small sample of like overall of the variability, but we'll have a better idea soon.
mm-hmm. Presumably some of the sounds, you could hear other sounds in the background, are from invertebrates. Like
yes.
Shrimp and things like that.
Absolutely. Well, on all of my measurements, actually. And one of the most, I guess, obvious was the data from Hornby Island. At night, it's just clicking away at higher frequencies, and so it must be like invertebrates. Although there's very little known about invertebrates, so that's another area of research.
Another PhD.
Snapping shrimp?
Was there a question?
The invertebrate clicking at nighttime, is it the snapping shrimp?
Well, I don't know. I guess like something clicking, I'm not sure.
There are lots of shrimp, different species. We don't have a so-called snapping shrimp here, but that's more of a tropical one. But
no, but there's a species that Ocean Networks Canada always detects on their hydrophones. They have a few locations that are famous for their density of, and you're right, it's not like a single species just as snapping shrimp, but they're the one that they have at depth on the coast, pervasive in ONC's data.
Yeah.
There actually some very cool research being done. Like researching on the invertebrates is also gaining some popularity. At least there's some more research being done. There's a researcher in France that is doing some sound from lobster and basically finding out that lobster makes sound and try to use the sound they make to monitor lobsters, which is really neat.
Yeah. Any other questions? Hearing none, I will thank Xavier for an excellent talk, and good luck with your research, and hopefully we'll maybe hear a few more species next year.
Thank you. That was a pleasure to do the talk. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Bye.